All right, it's top of the hour. Let's get rolling.
Wow,
Andy,
that was
give your normal intro.
Yeah, welcome to Tech Talk Tuesday, everyone. Dan, what episode number are we on? 10, I think, of season 2?
Yeah,
right?
it is. It is.
Episode 10 of season 2. And if you're joining us for the first time, you can catch all the previous recordings that we've done for season 1 and season 2. They're all on YouTube. The YouTube handle is Baseline Web Training, all one word, on YouTube. And we also have how-to videos and quick tips that Dan's been putting together to help you quickly get your controller up and running, to help you learn how to create base manager accounts, how to set up programming, and all those kinds of how-tos. So check us out on YouTube. And today you're only seeing the 2 screens, even though you have the 3 of us. So for quick intros.
How did we do that?
It's virtual.
It's virtual, yes.
We have Chris Wright, VP of Sales. Myself, Andy Humphrey, Irrigation Technology Consultant, and Dan Conger, our Training Manager.
Right on.
So Dan, why don't you take it from here and get us up to speed on where we left off last week.
So last week we did a kind of a broad overview of a travel company, Fortune 500 company in the Seattle market. And Tracy Shields joined us and we kind of walked through some of the controllers on there, some of the configurations, just some basic overview of the site and a little bit of some of those unique watering needs that they had on the site. So we just kind of teased with, had some pretty pictures, teased with some of the things that they were faced with. And then today we wanted to get into some of the programming and some of the how to solve those. So if you didn't see last week's episode, go to YouTube and watch that, and so you get some background on what we're talking about today.
Yeah, and were you going to tell us about the site, or should we just quickly remind the listeners how many controllers and sort of what the makeup was?
Right. Yeah, that's a good call. Good call. So there are a total of, is it 4 or 5 controllers? And I missed that from my list. I should have known that I was going to be quizzed on that. I believe there are 5 controllers. 4 base station 3200s that cover the landscape, and then 1 base station 1000 that covers a rooftop garden. Relatively simple as far as the flow setup, and they have 1 water meter, 1 master valve, 1 flow sensor, 1 controller. It's just 1 to 1 to 1 all the way through. Yep. Even though the base station 3200 can handle really complex configurations with 8 water sources, 8 control points, they're just going 1 to 1.
Yep. And quick housekeeping: if you're only seeing let's say Chris and I right now, because we're speaking, and then when Dan speaks, if you're only seeing Dan, you can change the Zoom view to be gallery. We just had a comment come in, so you can change your view to gallery, then you'd see all of us until Dan shares his screen, then you'd see that. So quick housekeeping note there. And then that was good, Dan, about the number of controllers. And we had a question last week about why we weren't using a flow station. And so I wanted to just remind us on this site, we do have multiple controllers. But as Dan mentioned, the hydraulics or the main lines and the points of connection are all separate. So each controller has its own water source, its own control point, its own main line, and they're not interlinked together. So if they were interlinked together, then we would need the flow station.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And since for simple sites, for simple configurations where there isn't that overlap, there isn't that potential conflict of one controller trying to grab the water and the other one being starved. Or we're doing very simple hydraulics, we don't need the flow station. So keep it simple, stupid, right? If don't go more complex if you don't need to.
Right, but this is a large site, so it may be straightforward hydraulically in terms of the number of water sources and number of main lines, but the configuration doesn't necessarily mean it's easy on a site that large.
Which is that's a perfect segue to what we wanted to talk about, Chris. So I'm going to share my screen and show you some of the things that I wanted to bring up. What we saw last week, we saw this picture of their corporate headquarters there in Seattle. And so what's really kind of cool about this building is we've got this, all this glass, this curving glass, and Tracy was recognizing some of the reflected glare that was going to be coming down onto the turf areas, lots of turf. Like, ooh, that's going to be kind of interesting. And the other thing that we noticed was so we've got some areas that are going to be really bright and shiny from the reflected light, but then there's other areas that are going to be kind of dark and shady. So like this courtyard here, So this same, perhaps the same controller, same site. This may or may not get rain, and then what's underneath that bridge isn't going to get any rain either. So we're definitely going to have some different irrigation needs around the site. The other thing that what they were starting to notice is that the rain, if it was coming in from the west, stuff on the east side of the building might not get as much moisture as the stuff on the west side of the building, right? Depending upon the prevailing wind. So those were all factors that they needed to address and that they're going to continue to address.
Right. So, this site controllers, single point of connection, feeding that controller in that main line. So what is it that's unique about Baseline's technology that helps in this configuration? Because this will pose some complexity in the programming side.
It's about
today when Andy and I were, prepping for the episode, we were talking about how this could be a great episode to talk about, looking at your programming and your configuration as spring is upon us, and verifying that you are ready for turn on, and you've got your programming correct. And then what data did you collect over the winter? From the sensors that are in the landscape that may help you to devise that irrigation strategy for the spring.
Yep. And part of that looking at the data and looking at the sensors in order to, kind of come up with your watering schedules and such. There's also the flow and the hydraulics part of it that sometimes gets forgotten about. Even if this project was installed last summer, last fall, or over the winter, it's important to take a look at your water source settings, your control point settings, your mainline settings, because those settings are often either missed entirely or there's only like one piece of data set in there and the master valve was never set up to close. So, as we look at the programming on this site, we thought it might be just a good time to sort of refresh on what we think are basic programming setups, but they're often missed.
True. Right. Yep. Absolutely. So, and the settings that you had in the controller for grow-in last fall are not necessarily appropriate for turn on this spring for the new irrigation season. So, soils have settled, plants have put on more root mass, perhaps, things are getting more established. So when we're looking at our sensors, should we recalibrate sensors? When we're looking at flow, should we relearn flow for the site? Those kinds of things that will greatly impact the performance of the system on turn on post grow in.
Wow, those are all, that's great. Some great best management or great transitional practices. I actually was starting even really simpler, because we see this ignored, is we've got 99 different programs on the base station 3200. Let's start taking advantage of them. So my thoughts were, if we have part of the turf that is exposed to additional sunlight from the reflected light, let's put that in a program. And then the turf on the other side of the building, it's still turf. It needs generally the same amount of water. Let's put that in another program and treat that separately, right? We could either later on, well, in a moment, we're going to talk about soil moisture sensors, but even if you're doing timed watering, you could change the schedule for that program. So just breaking them down rather than having to lump things together. And when I was a contractor, that was a challenge for me.
Yeah, it also brings up an interesting point, because I think that historically we've been paralyzed by too many programs because of the way, let's say, old-fashioned control systems handle programs and handle hydraulics.
Right.
If you set it up correctly in the controller, you can have as many programs as you want to, because the controller is going to run based on hydraulics and it'll run programs concurrently. So you don't have to worry about which programs are conflicting with other programs.
Because, pick me. Because our limiting factors are the size of our hydraulics and our available water window, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's going to determine how much we can irrigate at any given time or on at once. And so by learning the flow and by managing by flow and having the different programs, we can manage that correctly so that we're putting down as much water as we have available to us within the given water window that we have available to us.
Take advantage of the hydraulics that you have to compress your watering time. Spot on. Nice.
Yep. And with these different programs too, just thinking beyond it further, speaking to some of the unique capabilities that we have, with that start, stop, pause, and priority ability, we can identify those microclimates that either are high visibility, more sensitive plant material in a high, have a higher water requirement, whatever that may be, and prioritize those programs so that no matter what is irrigating at any given time, when that program calls for water based on a sensor input, then it's going to pause whatever is needed in order to irrigate that program, right? So lots of ways to manage it so that we're enhancing the performance of the system and increasing its efficiencies.
Nice. Awesome.
Without being paralyzed by too many programs. That's the key, is programs offer us opportunity versus making it more difficult.
Nice. So in the landscape areas, I wanted to bring in the idea of using soil moisture sensors. So now they've got soil moisture sensors for landscape. They've also got them for the green roof. So I wanted to look at specifically at the landscape areas. And for those, we'd want to set up a program specific for a landscape area with a soil moisture sensor. In this case, we've got a soil moisture sensor that's assigned or associated with zone 25. And this is using a lower limit watering strategy. And then all the other zones are linked to that zone 25 and the soil moisture sensor. So zone 25 is going to influence all these other zones in there. But then we need to take advantage. We got to watch out for those microclimates, right? Because we just talked about that a moment ago. Well, here's another way to address those microclimates is with that runtime or tracking ratio. So if we see that zone 25 is scheduled to run for 45 minutes, but then the tracking ratio is adjusted. So zone 27, tracking ratio is set at 90%. So it's going to run for a shorter period of time. And then zone 30 is set for 105%. So it will run for longer. So that's another way to accommodate or further dial in.
Dan, this brings up a good reminder for those of you that maybe are either new to baseline or new to sensors. Sometimes when we're with a room and we're training, we say, where should we put the sensor? And sometimes people's first thought is to put the sensor in the problem zone, right? To put the sensor where it's wet, to put the sensor where it's dry, hoping the sensor will fix the problem. When instead you want to do the opposite. You want to put the sensor in the good control zone, right? In the good zone, and then make up for those problems as you just described. So that area that seems to be always wet, you could link it to the sensor at only 25%. So it just gets a small portion of what the primary or the control zone gets.
Right. Use the sensor placement to kind of exploit the weakness of the other parts of that hydrozone. So you can look at whether it's DU or slope or drainage or whatever may be the case that is causing the deficiency in the other part of the hydrozone. But don't pull down the whole.
If you put the sensor in the problem, your whole site will act like the problem.
Yeah, right.
And I think if you could leave the majority of the zones at 100% tracking ratio and only tweak a few of them down, the problem child, if you will, that would be better than tweaking all of them up and having the sensor being the set.
Again, it's also, in addition to microclimates, it's also for maybe zones, I'm just speaking in terms of a retrofit as well. If there's a zone that doesn't have head-to-head coverage, that has single coverage, we know that zone has to run longer because it's inefficient. And so sometimes you can use the tracking ratio just to make up for known inefficiencies of a system that aren't related to plant type, soil type, or exposure.
Okay. The other thing,
can we address calibration for a minute?
Please, let's
talk about that and why that's important or what it means, because it's in the programming. You can push or click the drop down in Base Manager and have it as auto calibrate once or never, right? So what do those mean? And I think that creates some confusion in the user's mind too. It's kind of a scary door that they don't want to walk through because they think they'll break something, but it can be very, very helpful in identifying what the field capacity is and soil type that that sensor is buried in.
Right. Yeah. So that would be the key word is what's measurable is field capacity, because that's a measurable point. The dry down or the depletion, that's more of the art, right? That's the user gets to decide on dry down. And the plant health is going to determine how dry that plant can get. But we're able to measure field capacity, either using the historical observation method or the calibration method.
Right. So if you're a contractor, you install a sensor, what would you do? Would you calibrate? Would you calibrate once? Would you auto calibrate or would you not?
That's a great point, because if you're not told what to do and the design and specifications, you might not do any of it. Right. Because nobody actually put it on plan, put it in the specs and said, we want you to auto calibrate this site. You'll install the sensor. You may actually just walk away unless someone is requiring more of the setup. So I think just from my experience, I typically tell contractors to install it and observe over time if it's new construction.
Okay. And that's one way to do it. It's a kind of a manual calibration mode, right? But something that is unique to the technology that we have, and something that as more sensors come onto market and with the EPA WaterSense labeling going into effect, sensors are going to get more attention and perhaps more use, which is awesome because, all boats rise with the tide. So something that's unique with the baseline sensor is that auto calibration mode. So you can install the sensor, you can select auto calibrate, and the system is going to go out based on its programming, and it's going to water a series of irrigation events in an attempt to find that field capacity level. And essentially that works like upper limit watering. So you put it in, you install it, you select auto calibrate, and on the first watering, the system's going to turn on. It's going to water for the time that it's programmed to water. And if the sensor in that time frame sees field capacity, then it will calibrate and it will set that field capacity level for you, and then auto set a lower limit threshold for you, which is typically, I think it's 20 or 25% below that calibration value as kind of a safety set point. If it does not see field capacity in that first irrigation cycle, then the next time it's programmed to water, it's going to turn on. It's going to water for the time programmed in the controller plus another 20%, right? And do it again. And so this calibration process could take, depending on how often you have that zone programmed to irrigate, could take, a couple of days, or it could take several days and may result in some irrigation behavior that makes you think that something's not right because you may be watering longer than expected because the sensor is trying to find that field capacity level.
And sometimes using the example you just said of the runtime, let's just say for example, you set your rotors to 1 hour. It's going to try to reach field capacity. And so if the distribution uniformity or the application rate of that zone wasn't enough to actually push enough water to the sensor, and as Chris mentioned, it couldn't calibrate on that first cycle, even though you thought 1 hour was enough, the next time it goes through the calibration cycle, it's going to put down, I think you said 20% more or 25% more water. And that may seem like something's wrong. Right. You set the zone for an hour. Now it's running for 90 minutes or 80 minutes instead, because it's trying to push water to the sensor to get it up to field capacity and actually up to saturation.
Right. And that literally is how upper limit threshold watering works as well. You just have to understand how to apply the technology and what the behavior is going to be so that you know what to expect and are managing the landscape correctly.
So let's take a look at the green roof, because that's going to be, I think, perhaps another opportunity to use the upper limit. So on their green roof, we've got some relatively shallow rooted sedums in those brown and green areas. And I think this is a perfect spot for an upper limit, to use an upper limit to water up to field capacity when it's not at field capacity, because this is a media that dries out much quicker, and it's not going to hold as much moisture when compared to the landscape plants that are actually in field soil or the native soil.
Yeah.
So in this case, we've got the same primary and linked, but we're using an upper limit instead of a lower limit. So it's going to water every opportunity, every water day that's available. It's going to water up and fill up the soil profile to field capacity and then shut off. It won't run the entire time. It will run to the field capacity.
Yeah. And keep in mind, these are tools. And so I think it's important for us to remind our users, our contractors, our installers that they are tools, and we can tell you how they work and maybe give you some suggestions, but every turf manager, water manager, landscape manager has their own either previous experience, prior knowledge, or something in mind that they want to achieve, and they may choose upper or lower based on a number of different strategies. That there isn't really a one size fits all, or athletic fields should be lower, or they should be upper, or green roof should be lower, or they should be upper. It really depends on how that plant manager, if you will, wants to water and maintain the soil profile.
Bless you.
So a question came in. Let's address it real quick from Mr. Newberg, stating, shouldn't the practice be to install, observe, and make adjustments based on what you are seeing in the landscape? In other words, draw the percent up or down a few points. Sure. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that process, right? But not every water manager is going to be involved in the project long term or from the get-go. So you can use the auto calibrate process to help automate that.
And another observation that I've seen a lot of now that we're going into spring, it seems that in the springtime, plants can take a drier threshold because they're not stressed. It's typically, and turf grass, mostly what I'm speaking about here, but nights are still cooler. They can withstand drier conditions than they can in the summertime, where there is a lot more stress on that plant. And so sometimes that depletion has seasonal adjustments that are based on plant health and temperature and site conditions as well.
Exactly.
Nice. Okay. Fine. All good fine tuning. Yeah. So we saw this picture last week, this sloping landscape area that meets right up to a hardscape. You got to imagine that there's going to be runoff. And then Tracy pointed out the water feature that's right there. And could you imagine getting nitrate, fertilizer water into the water feature, or grass, even just grass clippings in the water feature? Runoff in circumstances like this is just not going to be a good thing. So the solution to manage runoff is going to be intelligent cycle and soak, right? So here we've got run times that we've set in. We just decided how long these spray heads need to run. In this case, they're between 12 and 9 minutes, kind of depends upon the zones. The cycle time in this case is 4 minutes. So we have determined that, or the water manager has determined that anything longer than 4 minutes is upwards of 5 minutes. We start to get runoff. It still needs a 12 minutes. So after a 45-minute soak, it's going to return and run another 4-minute cycle and do, in this case, for zone 94, it would do that 3 times. But in the case of zone 98, it's going to do it, two times, and then the third time will be a very short, pick up the last remaining minute. So but it won't run any longer than 4 minutes in any one particular cycle. Essentially giving it an opportunity to soak in, to penetrate the soil and make it down deeper into the root zone.
Yeah, Dan, can you flip back to that picture real quick? I know we have maybe 6 minutes left, but I think this is a great illustration to talk about how to put a sensor on this slope. And Chris and I recently observed a sensor on a different site that we believe was installed flat like this. because of the way that the moisture graphs were charting. Drying down, right? So as a reminder, perfect.
I've got my trusty prop here. So sensors get installed vertical, not horizontal,
like a knife,
right?
Cutting the soil.
Exactly.
Good point. Yes.
So you want to install it that way so you get drainage past the sensor blade and you don't get pooling on the sensor blade when it's installed flat, right?
Yep. And then on that slope, you'd want to put it up and down the slope so that water, as it's moving down the slope, also doesn't come up against it.
That's right. So don't create a dam, right? Have it aligned parallel to the slope so that it does not create that damming up against the sensor and giving you erroneous readings. Excellent.
Okay. So in this case, it would be 90 degrees to the slope and then angling down. Does it matter? I know the answer. Does it matter if the black portion with the bicoder in it is uphill or downhill?
No, sir.
Didn't think so. Okay. Right. Okay. No. Beautiful. So on that, I think the other cool thing about intelligent cycle and soak is that traditionally when we would do cycle and soak on another controller, we would extend our runtime. And well, that's not going to happen here because during that soak time, it's going to look for another zone to run. In this case, it's got opportunities to run. While 94 is soaking, it can run zone 95. And while zone 95 is soaking, it can run zone 96 and essentially keep a zone running, just letting the controller manage the hydraulics, managing the flow itself once we've set it up correctly.
That's right. So remember what we've talked about in the past. When runoff is initiated during an irrigation cycle, 80% of the water that's applied after that runoff is initiated is wasted, right?
Yep.
It's not absorbed into the soil, not utilized by the root zone. So best way to determine how long to cycle is what?
Guess. Ask a friend.
To observe, right? Turn on the zone, turn on that slope zone and run it and see how long it takes before you start to get runoff. And when it starts running off, then you know that you're, a good cycle time to start with.
And what's interesting about the observe is that's where a lot of water managers and contractors are comfortable with because they've done it. They just don't have any science behind it. They're using their eyes. And I think it's a good idea to continue to encourage people to do that.
Yeah. And then there's a lot of aha moments involved with seeing it with your eyes out in the landscape and then seeing what that looks like on a moisture curve.
Right.
When you connect those two dots, you realize your sort of cause and effect, and it makes a big difference.
Yep.
Are we just about out of time? Because I've got one more slide that I can share. If not,
we got about 3 minutes.
Okay, good deal. So the one last concept I wanted to bring up was they're right on the waterfront. They've got offshore breezes. They've got there may have been some tidal flooding here. They're definitely going to have some issues with salts in the soils, and they may not know that yet. But I suspect horticulturally they're going to have some. If they don't have, if all their plant material if any of their plant material is sensitive to salt burn or the salt content, that's going to be an issue. And they may want to do some leaching. So here's two thoughts on leaching that they might be able to set up. One is we've got all these programs, right? So let's set up a program just for leaching. So it's a specific program. And in this case, program 99, it's on there. It's salt leaching rotors, but it's disabled. So it's not in use right now. Okay. So if they need a leach quarterly or perhaps just annually, it really depends. But then they could set up a program and for leaching, the runtimes are typically 2 to 3 times the runtime. So here they've got a 90-minute runtime. They know that they need 90 minutes to move water with no salt to relatively clean through the soil profile and flush out the salts. But you apply 90 minutes of water, that's going to, it's just going to start running off. Well, between that and the cycle soak and a program that you're going to use occasionally, this might be a good strategy for them to use for salt leaching.
Yep, absolutely. And as a challenge to everybody, I challenge you to find a EC meter that puts a 4 to 20 milliamp output out, connect it to a 4 to 20 milliamp decoder, and then create a start, stop, or pause program based on that reading that would help automate that salt leaching process as well.
And you just challenged me. I'm going to go look for one on Amazon or someplace. I'm going to expense one in the next month, guaranteed.
Approved. All right, we're out of time. It's the bottom of the hour. I don't want to go. This is so fun. We haven't even had the winner of the Masters come in for an interview.
And the fire's warm now.
Yeah. So, unique situation today. We were happy to come to you live from Salt Lake City with Andy in-house and Cooper participating also. So what do we got on track for next week, Dan?
We're going to talk about solar for two-wire systems in baseline.
Isn't next week the 30th?
No.
Oh, it's the 23rd next week. Okay, solar.
You're
awesome.
trying to trick me again.
Sorry. Yeah,
I'm not going to do
solar
it.
is something that not a lot of people realize that we offer, and then when it comes up, there's a lot of questions about it. So it's just something we don't talk about enough.
True.
And we need to.
And it's going to become more relevant and important with new product releases we have scheduled for this year. So
yeah, right.
Very cool. Awesome.
Yep.
Hey, we appreciate everybody participating. Thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to join us. We hope it's informative. We're dedicated to bringing you good content on a weekly basis, and we really appreciate you joining. So with that said, please share with a colleague, someone that you work with, the link that may benefit from
Nice. Good
participating.
Good reminder.
Right? And let's get our usage up. So we've got hundreds of people that are registered. We want to triple that or quadruple that or whatever. So help us do that so we can help to inform the industry. So with that, from Butler Cabin, not in Salt Lake City, Utah, farewell.
From San Diego, we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.